My name is John Horgan. I'm the director of the Center for Science Writings. I have been hosting these talks at Stevens for a long time now, God, 15 or 16 years. So before I introduce today's speaker, I want to tell you about two upcoming events this spring. Very briefly, on March 2nd, we're going to have a talk by a guy named Lee Vinzel. He's an historian of technology who actually used to be at Stevens. He was a troublemaker at Stevens. He is still a troublemaker. He's going to give a talk on how innovation or obsession with innovation is harmful to us. And Stevens, of course, is the innovation university. So I thought this was a nice topic for our audience. On April 20th, we have a talk by David Wengrow, who's an archaeologist. He's the co-author of a book called The Dawn of Everything, which is a really radical look at human history and prehistory, and based on that, a vision of human possibilities. It's a really fascinating book and an uplifting book. And uplifting is what I need right now, and I assume a lot of you need it as well. So I hope you come to that, April 20th. All right, so now for today's speaker. Dave Chalmers is a professor of philosophy at NYU and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness. He's a real big shot in philosophy, is Dave Chalmers. I first saw him speak in 1994 at a conference in Arizona on the science of consciousness. And he gave a talk on what he called the hard problem of consciousness, which he distinguished from all other scientific problems in a way that was very compelling. He wasn't well known at the point, but I remember everybody in the audience perking up at this phrase, the hard problem. And that phrase has now become a meme. It's spread not only through science and philosophy, it's become part of pop culture. So Tom Stoppard, the great playwright, wrote a play called The Hard Problem that came out several years ago that was inspired by Dave Chalmers' work on consciousness. Dave is really good at writing clearly about very difficult philosophical issues, and he writes in a way that appeals to philosophers, to other experts in his field, and also to others, to lay people who are interested in some of these problems. And you just have to trust me, those of you who don't read a lot of philosophy, it's a real gift. It's very rare for a philosopher to be able to reach both colleagues and the public at large. So I'm thrilled that Dave is here today to talk about his latest book, which has already generated a lot of attention. The way this is going to work, Dave is going to talk for a little while. I'm assuming that a lot of you will have questions for him. You can submit questions by chat, and we'll try to get through Dave will try to get through as many as possible of those at the end of his talk. So, Dave, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John, and thanks to all of you for coming today. As John said, we go back a long way. 28 years ago, 1994, that conference in Tucson. Actually, you know, it was John Horgan who gave me my first big break. In a way, I gave that talk. He wrote it up in Scientific American, Consciousness, The Hard Problem, Never Look Back. So thanks, John, and it's great to be here talking with your group today. So lately, I've been thinking a lot about reality. In the past, I've thought a lot about consciousness. These topics, of course, are deeply connected, but I've been thinking a lot about reality, and especially artificial and virtual realities. I think they raise really some deep philosophical issues. So I've written this book, Reality Plus, which is really a philosophical meditation and a philosophical inquiry into virtual worlds and virtual realities. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so yeah, my subtitle, the title of the book and of the talk is Reality Plus. My subtitle is From the Matrix to the Metaverse, to name two of the most famous virtual worlds in science fiction. And as things go along, I think you'll see why they're both apt for the different subjects of the book and of the talk. Here's the book. The American edition has a butterfly on the cover. The British edition has clouds on the cover. But the subtitle is Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. And I want to think philosophically about virtual worlds. So first, what is a virtual world? As philosophers, we like to define our terms where we can. So I'd say a virtual world is an interactive, computer-generated world. The most important thing is that it's computer-generated, but it's also important that it be an interactive world that users can interact with. Here's a paradigmatic virtual world. This is a video game, a massive multiplayer online video game, World of Warcraft. In this case, a virtual world with all kinds of creatures and treasures and avatars and quests, massively interactive. Here's another one that's less game-like in its character. This is Second Life, which peaked back around 2007, but which is still going strong. This is a highly social virtual world in which people come to hang out, build communities, build relationships. Some people work there and are employed there and make money there, and so on. So this is also an interactive, computer-generated world. Neither of these, World of Warcraft or Second Life, are full-scale virtual realities. For virtual reality, we have a further condition, which is they be immersive. A virtual reality is an immersive, interactive, computer-generated world. To be immersive is basically to be experienced in 3 dimensions as if the world is all around you and you are there at the center. And these days, virtual reality is most often experienced through a virtual reality headset, such as here, the Oculus Quest 2, produced by Oculus, which is owned by Facebook or Meta. And this is probably the most popular VR headset right now. I've got my own. I use it quite often. You just you put it on, and suddenly there is a virtual world all around you. I think I've got some crazy noises, so let me now turn it off. So this is the Oculus Quest 2 used to experience virtual reality. Here is Beat Saber. This is a game you can play inside VR, slicing a bunch of cubes that come your way. Or here is one of the leading social virtual worlds you experience in VR. This is VR chat. These are steps in the direction of a metaverse, which is a full-scale online social virtual reality. Also, it's worth mentioning augmented reality technology, which is also immersive like virtual reality, but mixes physical reality and virtual reality. Of course, physical reality is immersive too. We experience it all around us, but through augmented reality glasses, you get to project digital objects among the virtual objects. So that's important too. My project here is to think philosophically about virtual worlds. It's an example of a genre I call techno philosophy, which basically is a two-way interaction between philosophy and technology, using philosophy to shed light on technology, but also using technology to shed light on philosophy. So on the one hand, I can think philosophically about virtual worlds and the issues that they raise. Are virtual realities a genuine form of reality? Can you lead a meaningful life there? I also think that thinking about virtual and artificial realities can shed light on some very traditional philosophical problems about reality. Can we know what is the nature of reality? What can we know about it? What is it to lead a good life? So in the book, I really try and engage in this two-way interaction. I'll try and give you some of that flavor here. My central topic is virtual worlds and virtual reality. And my central thesis is that virtual reality is genuine reality. It's a genuine form of reality. There's a long history of thinking of virtual worlds as second-class worlds, virtual reality as second-class reality. It's fictional, it's illusory, it's a hallucination, it's mere escapism. I want to say it needn't be any of those things. Maybe in some cases it is, but it needn't be. I want to say that virtual reality can be on a par with physical reality. It's different from physical reality. It's a form of digital reality, but it's no less real. And this thesis breaks down into three different sub-theses. Perhaps the most kind of way out thesis is that genuine reality, physical reality itself, could turn out to be a form of virtual reality. We might be in a virtual reality already. I'm not going to argue that we are in virtual reality, that we are in a computer simulation, but I do think it's something that we can't rule out. So I'll start with that way out thesis before bringing it back to theses which are more closely connected to current technology. I want to argue that virtual reality is not an illusion or a fiction, that the objects we interact with in VR really exist. Events in VR really happen. It needn't be an illusion at all. And third, I want to argue that we can lead a meaningful life in virtual reality. It needn't be escapism or frivolity or games. In principle, it can have meaning very close to, perhaps on a par with the levels in physical reality. So in what follows, I want to go through those three theses roughly in that order. I will do this by reference to these two tent poles from science fiction, the Matrix and the Metaverse. The Matrix kind of stands for the idea that the universe could turn out itself to be a giant simulation. The Metaverse stands for the idea of the coming virtual reality technology that we'll be using in coming years, coming decades, and is in front of us. So I'll start by focusing on the Matrix, then go on to the Metaverse. So the Matrix is great because it's an illustration of the simulation hypothesis, the hypothesis that we are ourselves living in a lifelong computer simulation. And if you look at Matrix, here's Matrix Resurrections, but way back in the first Matrix movie, Neo wakes up in the beginning of the movie. He's in what seems to be a perfectly ordinary physical reality, but at a certain point he takes the red pill and discovers he had been living his whole life in this giant computer simulation, the Matrix. So here is Neo's world. It's seemed to be a normal world, but actually it turns out to be a digital world. And as soon as we raise this hypothesis, the question arises, how do we know, could this be happening to us? Could we ever know that? Could we ever rule it out? Here's an illustration of two ways. Meeting the Oracle. Trinity is actually a biological creature hooked up to the Matrix, who has a brain and a body, and her brain is somehow jacked into this computer simulation via cables and so on. The Oracle, by contrast, is a machine. She is herself a computer-generated creature, part of the simulation, if you like. So illustrated here by their being connected to a brain and to a computer, respectively. These are two ways of being in a simulation, biologically or being simulated yourself. I want to count both of these as versions of the simulation hypothesis. I would argue that it's possible that either of these things could, in principle, be happening to us. So the question then is, how do you know you're not in a simulation right now? You might think you have some evidence that you're not in a simulation. Maybe your cat is so amazing, all that fur, all those antics. It's like, how could that be part of a simulation? But on reflection, it sure looks like any evidence you get could, in principle, itself have been simulated. If the simulators were good enough, they could replicate that evidence for you. In principle, a simulation could be indistinguishable from physical reality. If it is, you may never be able to rule that out. I mean, it could be that if you are in a simulation, It could be you could get some conclusive proof that you are in a simulation if they do enough convincing things to show you. They give you a red pill, they show you the source code, they turn the Empire State Building upside down, and so on. But there's no way we could ever conclusively rule it out. And this is wonderful for a philosopher, because it's very reminiscent of ideas throughout the history of philosophy. The ancient Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi said, how do I know that I'm Zhuangzi, who dreamed he was a butterfly, as opposed to, I could be a butterfly dreaming. He's Zhuangzi. How do I know I'm not dreaming right now? In the 1640s, Rene Descartes went to town on ideas like this. He asked the question, how do I know I'm not dreaming? How do I know my senses aren't fooling me? And most famously, he asked, how do you know an evil demon isn't deceiving you by producing sensations of an external world when none of it is real? That's kind of an early predecessor of the simulation idea. Here I have an illustration of the evil demon idea where the evil demon does his work in a high-tech way by actually using computer simulation technology. The evil demon is there programming up a computer, sending sensations to sending signals to a brain that gets all these inputs and experiences ordinary reality. The brain, I mean, if it's like Descartes says, even if I doubt external reality, I can always be sure at least that I'm thinking and that I exist. I think, therefore I am. So here we have the brain in a vat, getting that far, but the brain in a vat is actually in a giant computer simulation and doesn't know this. All these illustrations, by the way, there are 57 amazing illustrations in this book, all by the illustrator Tim Peacock, who is a genius at illustrating some of these philosophical ideas and science fiction scenarios. I find that really adds a whole lot to the philosophical experience of these issues. So these days we ask Descartes' question about evil demon or dreaming in this more high-tech way. How do you know you're not in a simulation right now? We could even put Descartes himself into virtual reality. He thinks he's sitting by the fire with a paper in his hand, his dog at his feet. Maybe all that could be virtual reality. I think the simulation hypothesis improves on, it's kind of continuous with Descartes' hypotheses, but I think it improves on them in one respect, which is that as VR technology develops, we're actually going to have this computer simulation these computer simulations indistinguishable from physical reality at some point. I mean, we're not quite there yet. Virtual realities are still somewhat primitive, but give it 50 or 100 years, I wouldn't bet against us having simulations indistinguishable from physical reality. We'll actually have them there in front of us. We'll be able to put people in those simulations, and then it becomes a very live possibility. I mean, we could ourselves be in such a simulation ourselves. So I think the technology is actually giving us extra reason to take these ideas seriously. There's also an argument due to the philosopher Nick Bostrom that statistically it may be likely we're in simulations. We're in a simulation. Simulated worlds may turn out to greatly outnumber unsimulated worlds because many civilizations will create many simulated civilizations. Maybe there are, 100 simulated versions of me floating out there and just one original. Like, what are the odds that I'm actually the original, the unsimulated one? That's a case for taking it very seriously. We're in a simulation. Oh, here's a picture of the philosopher Bertrand Russell and Bostrom having an argument. Russell thought that ordinary reality was the simplest hypothesis, so we should accept that over Descartes' scenarios. But Bostrom is pointing out, well, actually, it may turn out there are many more simulations out there than unsimulated worlds. So we should, on statistical grounds, accept that one instead. I don't need to go all the way with Bostrom to say that we are, in fact, probably in a simulation. By the way, the other day, the New York Times ran a nice article on some of these issues by Farhad Manjoo, their technology writer, where he attributed to me the view that we are probably in a simulation, and that was the headline. I said, well, actually, that's not quite my view. I got them to change it to we might be in a simulation. Okay, still crazy, but maybe just a little bit less far out. Then At one point, in the book, I foolishly put a probability on it and said, maybe 25% we're in a simulation. We can explore that if you like. But the key idea is that we might be in a simulation just in the sense that we can't rule it out. Upshot, we can't know we're not in a simulation. So you might think, okay, bad news. We might be in a simulation. And you might think, actually, well, the news gets even worse. Descartes used this for an argument that you can't know anything about the external world. Here's his argument. First premise is the one we just looked at. We can't know we're not in a simulation. We then combine it with a common view of simulations. If we're in a that anything is real. Now that's really depressing. That's really bad news. It looks like we can't know anything about the external world. But I want to resist the bad news. I accept premise one. You might think that was bad news, but the second part of the story I want to treat as good news. And this is the connection between simulations and reality. The common view is simulations are illusions. The common view is virtual reality is illusory reality. But that's what at this point in the argument I want to contest. Here's the common view expressed by Cornel West, the American philosopher who actually appears in the Matrix movies, playing Counselor West of Zion. And you can kind of see him escaping from one simulation after another. The Matrix up to the world of Zion. Then there he is, Cornel West in the USA. And oh boy, it's still a simulation. It's still an illusion. So Cornel West says it's illusions all the way down. But I want to resist the idea that simulations have to be illusions. My view is, yeah, we might be in a simulation, but even if we are in a perfect simulation, the world around us is still perfectly real. There are still tables and chairs, this glass of water still exists. These books still exist. They may ultimately be digital objects, but they're no less real for all that. They still exist in the world around me. This is great for a philosopher. I mean, the Matrix movies just, this raises issues like, what is it to be real? As illustrated in the Matrix movies. Neo says, this isn't real. Morpheus says, what is real? How do you define real? And that's a very important question in this context. What actually do we mean by real? And I think there's no single fixed meaning for real. There's many different strands to the concept. But I'd say that here are three central strands. We say something is real first if it makes a difference. It actually has causal powers within the world. It can do something. Joe Biden is real because he can help to pass laws and start wars and so on. Actually makes a difference in the world. We also say something is real if it isn't all
First
in.
floor?
Okay, someone's got to mute.
What?
Sorry, you got to mute. Okay, we also say something is real if it isn't all in the mind. Say a dream or something. Maybe there's a sense in which we're experiencing something, but what we're experiencing is produced by our mind. In that case, we say if it's fully dependent on our own mind, it isn't fully real. Whereas if something is outside our mind, then it's real. And third, we say something is real if it isn't an illusion. Maybe I have an experience of a pink elephant over there, but there's actually no pink elephant there. Things are not as they seem, so it's not real. Whereas if things are as they seem, then we say they're real. So those are three strands. I would argue all three of those strands can be met if we're in a simulation. I'm going to say if we're in a simulation, the objects around us are real digital objects. They make a difference to the world. Inside the simulation, the tables and chairs are interacting with each other. They're interacting with me. They're not all in the mind. I could, I'm not generating the simulation. I could leave and come back. Different people can experience the same thing. The matrix is out there independently of your mind running on a computer. And I would argue they're not an illusion. The tables and chairs really are there. They're just digital. Being digital is, okay, it's different from being physical perhaps, but it's no worse than being made of quantum processes. Boy, you look at current physics and it tells you that the tables and chairs out there are made of these evanescent quantum waves, but does that mean they're not real? Most people don't say that. They say they're still real. I think likewise for being digital, being made of bits. It's still a way of being perfectly real. I actually think the simulation hypothesis is best seen as a version of the so-called it's from bit hypothesis that the physicist John Wheeler put forward, where everything in the physical world is made of bits. Maybe there's plants and animals are made of cells, which are made of molecules, which are made of atoms, which are made of quarks. Underneath all that is a level of bits. So here's it from bit. We've got the trees, we've got the atoms, and we've got like a digital level of the interplay of bits underneath it, the bits obeying some rules of their own. It could even be that bits are not the bottom level. Underneath the bits is something even more basic. And then we have what I call the it from it idea, where underneath the bits is something else. If we're in a simulation, it may well be that underneath the atoms is a level of bits. Underneath the bits is maybe a circuit board in the next universe up, illustrated here. So the its are made of something else. And importantly, when physicists think about this it from bit idea, the world contains digital objects. It's not a version where things aren't real. It from bit objects are perfectly real. They're just digital, which is not a way of being unreal. Here's an illustration I like. You can imagine two different ways of creating the universe. The traditional God said, "Let there be light," but I guess the digital God instead says, "Let there be bits," and creates some bits. And everything, atoms, molecules, tables, chairs, horses, come from the bits, and they're perfectly real. On the right, we have a simulator setting up the simulation. This is a simulator God here, represented by a teenage hacker in the next universe up. And she programs the simulation, puts all the bits into place, and likewise, they support reality. I would argue these two scenarios are basically equivalent. And the simulated it from bit world, the its are just as real as in the one where God creates the bits. Okay, so if that's right, then it means, okay, so the bad news was we could be in a simulation. But the good news is, even if we're in a simulation, things are perfectly real. Yeah, things are digital, but they're no less real. For all that, they're still there, they're still out there. They just have a different underlying nature from what we thought. Okay, so that kind of concludes the first half, the matrix half, the simulation half, and gets us halfway to our thesis that virtual reality is genuine reality. Now I want to switch gears to the metaverse half. This idea of the metaverse gets used in various different ways. It originates with Neil Stephenson in his 1992 science fiction novel, Snow Crash, which is really a classic in this virtual reality genre, where the metaverse was a single massive social virtual world that people visited by putting on virtual reality headgear and the like, and people worked and played and had fights, made enemies, made money. It kind of serves as a model for the metaverse ambitions of today. But of course, recently the term metaverse has been grabbed, perhaps appropriated by corporations, most famously by Facebook, which renamed itself Meta to illustrate as a statement of its ambitions to make the metaverse happen. I think at this point, metaverse has come to mean, instead of a single virtual world where all this happens, rather it's like an ecosystem, a global interconnected system of virtual worlds, kind of like the internet as a global interconnected system, except it's experienced immersively. You experience the internet from the inside as a system of virtual worlds, virtual and augmented realities. Just something like that is the coming contemporary use of the term metaverse. But either way, I think it raises some pretty deep philosophical issues. Here's a dystopian version of the metaverse. Here the idea is that Mark Zuckerberg is actually running Plato's cave. You all know Plato's cave, where we might be prisoners chained to be watching shadows drift by on the cave wall when reality is happening outside. Some people might see virtual reality that way. Here we are in VR headsets with Zuckerberg running the show, Plato's cave for the 21st century. My own view actually is that VR needn't be quite as dystopian as this, and I'll get there towards the end of the talk. But here is the downside of the metaverse, if you like. But yeah, the metaverse and the matrix raise somewhat different issues. I mean, the metaverse is somewhat more down to earth. It's actually coming, and in coming decades, you don't spend your life in current VR. You know, to enter the metaverse, you put on again one of these headsets, and maybe you use it for half an hour or for a few hours. But yeah, after a while, you come out. You certainly don't spend your whole life there. While you're there, you know you're using VR. The knowledge question, am I in VR, doesn't really arise. You know you are. And it's much simpler, at least for now, than a full-scale universe simulation. So somewhat more down to earth, but still raises very similar issues. Not least, is the metaverse a world of illusions? Are things real in the metaverse and in existing virtual worlds? Again, a long history of people saying no, even proponents of the idea. William Gibson, who coined the term cyberspace in his 1980s novel Neuromancer. By cyberspace, it seems pretty clear he actually meant virtual reality. He took it that virtual reality as a consensual hallucination. It's not real, it's a hallucination. Here's the movie Ready Player One, based on the Ernest Cline novel. Late in the movie, one character says, reality is the only thing that's real. Meaning, I think, is pretty clear. Physical reality is real. Virtual reality may be fun, but it's not real. So again, expressing the idea that VR is not real, it's an illusion. And that's the idea that, again, I want to resist. The standard view, virtual objects are unreal, they're illusions, hallucinations, or fictions. My view, virtual objects, even in existing VR, are perfectly real. They're just non-illusory digital objects. I already made that case talking about the matrix, the full-scale simulation. For in a full-scale simulation, the objects we're interacting with are real digital objects running on a computer. But I think by the same token, this generalizes to ordinary VR. Even in ordinary virtual reality worlds, the objects we're interacting with are real digital objects running on a computer. When you interact with a virtual avatar or treasure or a building, there's a real data structure there, a digital object on a computer that you're interacting with, and it needn't be an illusion. This is one analogy I like is between virtual kittens and robot kittens. I mean, on the left, we have a biological kitten. I don't want to say that virtual kittens or robot kittens are the same as biological kittens. You might say in a certain sense, they're not real kittens. But the robot kitten is still a perfectly real object. It's an object there, it has causal powers, it can do things in the world. In principle, it could eventually be as complex as a biological kitten. I want to say the virtual kitten is at least on a par with the robot kitten. It may not be a real kitten, but it's a real object with real causal powers out there independently of us. So it's at the very least a real thing. And just as a robot kitten needn't be an illusion, nor is a virtual kitten. So is VR an illusion? One worry is that things in VR, things seem to be out there in physical space where they're not. So even if there's like even if a virtual building is a real digital building, the question is, when I experience it as out there in physical space in front of me, is that an illusion? Because, you know, there isn't actually a physical building physically in front of me. Well, what I want to say is that if you're a beginner in VR, if you're a novice user, then using VR for the first time, you may at least initially experience objects as being out there in physical space in front of you. And that will be an illusion. But many expert users of VR, I think, they know perfectly well they're in VR. They adapt to VR. They interpret everything they're seeing as virtual. Expert users of VR experience objects as being in virtual space. And I think that needn't be an illusion. And so I would say that expert users of VR actually have non-illusory perception of virtual worlds, and it needn't be an illusion at all. Okay, so that completes my case for the second main thesis, that virtual realities or genuine realities, that virtual objects and events, they're real and they needn't be illusions. The final thesis, the final question then is, can one have a meaningful life in a virtual world? Can life in VR in principle be roughly as good, perhaps even better than life in non-virtual reality? Here again, the history of philosophy is against me. There are classic arguments that this seems to be impossible. The philosopher Robert Nozick, in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia in the 1970s, put forward the thought experiment of the experience machine, where your body is floating in this pod, but somehow you're connected to a system which is pre-programmed to give you experiences of being a highly, here the idea is that Nozick himself might be in the experience machine. That's why he's a highly successful author with a wonderful family, a job teaching at Harvard and so on. But this is all just a pre-programmed script in the experience machine. Nozick said, should you enter the experience machine, pre-programming wonderful experiences for life? And he answered that question with a resounding no. You should not enter the experience machine. And he gave three central reasons. First, and maybe most important, the experience machine is pre-programmed. You just live out a script in the experience machine. You have no autonomy, no free choice. Second, the experience machine is a world of illusions. It's illusory. It doesn't give you contact with reality. And third, he said, the experience machine is artificial. It's human-made. You have no contact with nature. I think there's a lot to say about each of these three reasons, but most fundamentally, what I want to say is that none of those reasons that Nozick gave as reasons not to enter the experience machine are good reasons not to enter VR. With respect to the first and most important reason, I think this is a fundamental difference between VR and the experience machine. Maybe the experience machine is pre-scripted, but VR is not. Even like Second Life, you go into Second Life, there's no script for what happens next. You can decide what to do. You can make your own life in Second Life, and even in existing virtual worlds, like say VR chat, even in a video game like a kind of, well, you know, the likes of Minecraft or Roblox or Fortnite, you have some element of free choice. So I would say VR is not pre-programmed, it's interactive. I've already argued that VR needn't be an illusion. You're actually having genuine contact with virtual realities. It's true that VR may be artificial. So if you're after nature, you won't get it in VR, it's human made. But of course, the same goes for cities. You know, many of us are spending most of our time in cities, which are not terribly natural, they're human made. And I would say, okay, it may not be to everyone's taste, but for many of us, you can lead a perfectly meaningful life in a city, in an artificial environment. And I think precisely the same is true for virtual worlds. I mean, this kind of raises the question, where does meaning and value in our lives come from? I guess I think meaning and value in our lives comes from the experiences that we have, from the relationships that we build with our loved ones, our family, our friends, our colleagues, our students, our projects and our achievements, maybe, you know, being able to help other people and build communities. I think you can do all of that in VR. You know, other people are genuinely present. In VR, you can have genuine friendships, genuine relationships. I mean, right now, of course, there are some serious limits on VR, but in the long term, all kinds of things are going to be possible. I don't want to say that VR is exactly on a par with physical reality. I mean, at least for now, of course, it's primitive in all kinds of respects. You know, the objects in VR are kind of cartoonish. The bodily senses are kind of hopeless. You can't eat and drink or have sex or anything, you know, fully physical like that in VR. And in the long term, some of those things may turn out to be possible in VR, but it may be still missing some sources of value for some people. If you're after nature, or if you're after sheer physicality, you won't get that in VR. But I think those things are, you know, those things are at least optional. They're not necessary for a meaningful life. There are interesting questions about the role of birth and death in VR, which are very meaningful aspects of our life, harder to achieve in VR, but I mean, interesting question, but say in a fully simulated world, there could eventually be genuine birth and death. But more importantly, I think VR also has new sources of value. New bodies and new forms of experience, near unlimited space, abundance of goods. It's so, things are so easy to manufacture in VR, the digital objects, you can duplicate them just like that. There's instant travel and communication. I would say in the long term, it's rational for some people to prefer to spend most of their time in physical reality. But it's also going to be rational for others to prefer to spend a whole lot of time in virtual reality. I mean, I'm not saying abandon the physical world, at least in the short term. We're all going to be spending enormous amounts of time in the physical world, and we need to attend to it and take care of it. But if somebody, many of us already spend 12 hours a day on the internet. If someone chooses to spend 12 hours a day in VR, I think that can be perfectly meaningful for them. Here's an illustration of the choice. On the left, you've got the choice to enter virtual reality and maybe go into this pod where you get to inhabit this virtual world, amazing experiences like flying and more. On the right, you get to go to a terraform reality. Maybe a planet, an exoplanet out there has been terraformed to make these wonderful new cities possible, and you could take a rocket ship there. What I would say is there can be pros and cons to each choice, but either choice is reasonable. It's not like the one on the left is meaningless and the one on the right is meaningful. I think they're roughly on a par. So I would say then, yes, you can live a meaningful life in VR. Life in VR may be good, it may be awful, but the full scale of human experience is available. Importantly, I'm not saying that VR is going to be some kind of utopia. I mean, this is something people often raise. Isn't VR a dystopia or is it a utopia? Well, I would argue neither of those. I very much doubt that VR will be a utopia. I also doubt that it will be a full-scale dystopia too. I think it's got the potential for both. There are both utopian and dystopian elements potentially in VR. On the utopian side, there's new bodies, new forms of experience, especially for people whose access to the physical world is limited, like say, disabled people, aging people, oppressed people. Then I think, VR offers special attractions for, having new forms of access to reality. Near unlimited space in VR, this virtual abundance that objects could, in principle, be duplicated just like that. Of course, this raises, the idea that VR could end up being a post-scarcity society. Of course, there are going to be many market forces running against that. The non-fungible token is a way to try and combat this virtual abundance by, giving rights to an original object that can't be copied. This kind of brings out then some of the potentially dystopian elements. VR, one of the major factors is that virtual worlds right now are mostly run by corporations, governed by corporations, if you like. They're corporatocracies, or corporations kind of serve as the gods of these worlds. So you have, Apple's version of reality, Facebook's virtual world, Google's reality. And, the creator of a virtual world is a little bit like the god of that world, as we saw already. They're potentially omniscient. They can know everything that's going on. They're potentially omnipotent. They can be all powerful about what's going on. So if you thought, privacy issues or manipulation issues were a big deal in social media, wait till corporations are actually controlling the virtual worlds, basically controlling the air that you breathe. So I very much hope there are routes to virtual world which are not fully controlled by corporations, a so-called open metaverse, which includes many different forms of life, many different forms of government, which include worlds that are user-controlled and user-governed. There's also going to be issues about unequal access to virtual worlds. You can bet that most of the forms of power, domination, inequality in the virtual world are going to be very hard to resist in virtual worlds as well, not to mention neglect of the physical world. These are all dystopian possibilities. Again, if I was to spell out a more utopian future, it'd be one with many virtual worlds that users could choose between, as well as having the choice of inhabiting different societies in the physical world as well. And then different people get to choose their own utopia, if you like. That's a situation that Robert Nozick once called meta-utopia, where people get to choose their own society. I don't know. This is mostly science fiction at this point, but I think it's good to reflect on the potential utopian and dystopian elements. If I had to guess, I'd say the metaverse is going to be like the internet. Look, the internet has brought wonderful things. It's brought awful things. If I had to sum it up, I'd say the net value has been positive and quite positive, but it's not to say it hasn't had a large downside. I suspect the metaverse will be similar. I would hope that the net value will be positive, but I think we have to wait and see. Okay, so to sum up my conclusions, virtual reality is genuine reality. I think the rest is up to us. Thank you very much.
If this was in the auditorium at Stevens, you would hear resounding applause now, Dave. All right, so there have been a lot of questions already. I want to start you off with my kind of gut reaction to the simulation hypothesis, the metaverse, and it's kind of moralistic. So, and it's of a piece with my reaction to the fondness of a lot of scientists for the multiverse right now, and even the fantasies about colonizing Mars. The world is a mess right now. There is terrible human suffering. We have these very serious problems, the pandemic and climate change, lots of other things. And so I fear that when the intellectuals are talking about the multiverse and metaverse and the simulation possibility and go into Mars, it all strikes me as kind of escapist and even decadent. You must have encountered this response, and I just wonder how you feel about that.
Yeah, I guess I don't see why it's escapist or decadent. I mean, if it was actually blocking progress on those things, if it somehow turned out that thinking about the simulation hypothesis or the multiverse was actually making things worse for climate change by for example, people started thinking about this as this is how we can avoid the problems of climate change by entering simulations or by going to Mars. And if that then demotivated people to work on climate change, then that would be a serious problem. I see zero evidence anything like that is happening. There are plenty of obstacles to people thinking seriously about climate change. And there are a lot of pathologies out there right now, but the simulation hypothesis and the multiverse, those are not the pathologies that are stopping us working on climate change properly. So short of that, it's just the idea that it seems like distasteful to you. I don't know, does like reading novels seem distasteful and decadent to you when you're when all these things are going on? Does thinking about history or even thinking about philosophy seem decadent to you while all this is going on? I don't see why you can't be perfectly serious about handling the problems of the world, but also think philosophically about what's coming in the future and about what could be about the philosophical status of reality.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just going to try to summarize. You can see there are a lot of questions, comments, some of them kind of long and complicated. If you see any you want to respond to, that's fine, just tell me, but I'm just going to pick a couple out. One I'm going to summarize as materialism versus idealism, and whether
Can you tell me the name of the person, because then I can click through the chat to find it.
It was kind of one of the it was a reference to Donald Hoffman.
Okay.
You know Hoffman's thesis that, and there are other people who are saying the same thing, that the basis of reality isn't matter, it's mind. So I wonder if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, I believe that reality exists outside the mind, or at least outside my mind. There is the possibility that, maybe there could be this could all exist somehow in God's mind or in the simulator's mind and so on. But I do think there's reality outside of my mind. Hoffman's view gets complicated here. He's ultimately an idealist. I take one form of idealism I do take seriously is panpsychism, the idea that some element of mind at the bottom of physical reality. Each particle has its own bit of consciousness. But another related view is so-called cosmopsychism, that the whole cosmos could be conscious, and that constitutes reality. But for me, I guess these are just these are possible hypotheses about the ultimate nature of physical reality to put alongside the idea that it's it from bit, to put alongside the idea that it's structure. Consciousness is one possible realizer for all that reality. In the book, I talk about the it from bit from consciousness hypothesis, and I can't rule that out. Maybe underneath those bits is some level of consciousness, and that would be a world ultimately in which everything is mind. I take that seriously as a possibility. I just don't see any reason right now to choose that one over the other possibilities, not least because if it helped explain consciousness, that would be a very good reason too. But there is the combination problem for these views. How do those bits of consciousness add up to my consciousness? No one that I've seen so far has solved that problem, including Hoffman. If they do, fantastic.
Another kind of nitty-gritty question from one of my colleagues, Teresa McPhail, has to do with some of the adverse effects that are caused by virtual reality right now. And I would just sort of add adverse effects from people spending a lot of time looking at their screens, a lot of time on social media, psychological effects, possibly physiological effects. Is that something that you're worried about?
I mean, yeah, and I think the literature here is very mixed. And yeah, as far as I can tell, it doesn't speak with one voice that, VR is bad for health, or some people use VR in ways which is good for health. Apparently, during the pandemic, there's been a big uptick in people using VR workout regimes, for example, which I know a couple of people for whom this has been extremely effective. That game Beat Saber and so on, playing that every day has helped them lose a lot of weight. But I mean, obviously we have to take this seriously, and obviously there are limits right now on what you can do with the body in VR. I do hope, I mean, a lot of people think that the future here may well lie as much with augmented reality as with virtual reality. So you still stay in contact with the physical world while experiencing the virtual world. And I don't think there are really good studies on the health effects of augmented reality yet, because augmented reality technology hasn't caught on to the same extent. But it could well be that in the long run, I mean, in the long run, it's all going to be an empirical question about how that technology interacts with the human brain and body. I don't think the technology we have now in 2022 is necessarily indicative of where it will be in 10 or 20 years.
So this is another question of my own. It has to do with the problem of evil. It seems to me that the simulation hypothesis is kind of just another God hypothesis, except with computer technology mixed in. And the question is, well, if we were created by a hacker, some divine or not divine force, what can we infer about the mind of that creator from how reality is for us, from the sort of fairness or unfairness of it, the randomness, the degree to which people suffer? Is that something that you think about?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, those questions are, I mean, many of the traditional theological questions do come up with respect to the simulation hypothesis. Yeah, how could our simulators permit the Holocaust? How could they permit so many deaths from the pandemic and so on? So one possibility is they don't care about ethics or morality. Yeah, the God of the simulation may be all powerful and all knowing, but no particular reason to think they're all good. Maybe they just went ahead and created this for their scientific purposes without caring. On the other hand, maybe they had to put all this past institutional review board to make sure that the simulation got ethics approval. And who's to say? Maybe the review board has some rules. They say, okay, some review boards may say, okay, any suffering is out. Okay, and then they would not have created our worlds. Others may say, okay, it's okay to create suffering as long as you create on net more happiness. And maybe then you could justify the creation of this awful world that way. This is what they call a theodicy in the philosophy of religion, an explanation of how evil in the world is compatible with a benevolent God. Well, maybe you could try and tell some such story for simulators too.
One of my students, Tim Luft, asked a question about whether there are uncomputable physical processes that might lead us to think that this is not a digital simulation. I just wonder, to what degree do you find that interesting, whether there are ways that we can sort of convince ourselves that we're not in a computed reality?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question that takes me back to that first Tucson conference we were at in 1994, where Roger Penrose was there arguing that, there are actually non-computable physical processes in quantum mechanics and in the human brain that generate things that no computer could ever do. So you might say, if there are processes like that, then we can never be simulated, at least by a classical computer, and the simulation hypothesis might be ruled out. I guess one thing I think is that, I'm very skeptical of this Penrose view, that there are uncomputable processes. But if there are, we ought in principle be able to bottle those uncomputable processes and use them for a new form of computing. People have already done this with quantum processes being kind of bottled and used for these amazingly parallel quantum computers. If Penrose is right, there's something new and extra in quantum gravity, let's say. In principle, we ought to bottle that and produce quantum gravity computers. And then we can just run quantum gravity simulations of all this in our brains and of the physical world. And maybe that kind of non-computable simulation could end up generating exactly the same issues.
Somebody before, when I was publicizing this talk, somebody sent me a link to an article in a British newspaper about a woman who claimed that she was sexually assaulted in the metaverse. And it raises the question, you're sort of saying we should take virtual reality seriously. This raises the question, how serious is it? I mean, should there be legal consequences for some of the things that might happen in the metaverse?
Yeah, my view is yes, in principle. And I mean, this does, I think, parallel the experiences that people have been through these virtual sexual assaults have, which is often finding them very traumatic in ways at least analogous to the ways in which sexual assaults in the physical world can be. I don't want to say they're exactly on a par. The physical body to us is more important to us as things stand than the virtual body, but people really care about their virtual bodies. And I think, Meta's reaction of instituting this 4-foot bubble around people is indicative of that. But I think in the long run, we're going to have to take, assaults in the virtual world, treat them at least as continuous with assaults in the physical world. The same is true for theft. There's virtual theft. This is not just theft in a video game anymore. That can, in principle, be real theft. So I think this is a point where our legal and moral system may have to catch up.
I think you might have already answered this question, but another one of my colleagues, Greg Morgan, a philosopher at Stevens, raised the question of does there have to be a physical ground of being? I guess this is what you brought up with something that is even lower than more fundamental than the it from bit, or can it be simulations all the way down?
Yeah.
And it seems to me, if it's simulations all the way down, then the concept of a simulation loses its meaning. I mean, the whole idea of a simulation assumes that there's a ground of being and then there's the simulation.
It's an interesting idea. In the book, I talk about the idea sometimes attributed to the story, sometimes told of, maybe it's William James or sometimes Bertrand Russell, that he's giving a talk about the nature of reality, and someone comes up to him at the end of the talk and says, I know the nature of reality. Everything's standing on the back of a turtle. And then James or Russell says, what's the turtle standing on? Oh, another turtle. And then James says, the person says, don't worry, mister. I know what you think. It's turtles all the way down. So could it be simulations all the way up? I guess that is kind of mind-boggling to me. I'm tempted by the view there has to be a fundamental level, a fundamental non-simulated level, but the philosopher Jonathan Schaffer has speculated that, at least in physics, there needn't be a base point. It could just keep getting down, 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 ever further. if that's the case, then you could imagine, yeah, simulations upon simulations upon simulations, all the way down to infinity. I'm not sure that's incoherent. It's very
All right,
bizarre.
so it's a little past 5. I'm just going to ask you one final question. You've been thinking about consciousness for a long time. I've seen your ideas about how consciousness might be modeled scientifically, possibly even understood. What's your feeling about whether consciousness is actually a scientifically solvable problem now?
I think at the very least we're carving bits off from the philosophy of consciousness into science. I mean, with space and time, Newton carved a whole lot off so that space and time became, over time, a scientific problem, which is not to say there aren't philosophical problems in back of it. I guess something is happening more slowly with consciousness. We're at least studying some features of consciousness and building a science of how that connects to the brain, which is increasingly systematic, but still very far from developed. It wouldn't surprise me if in, say, 50 or 100 years' time, we have a pretty good set of principles mapping physical processes in the brain to consciousness. That is still going to leave the philosophical problem of consciousness there in back of that, which is, why is there consciousness in the first place? Why are these principles the basic principles of consciousness? I lean towards the view that some things in the universe have to be taken as primitive, like space and time. Some fundamental laws have to be taken as primitive, and we may have to do something like that with consciousness. If you're satisfied with that as a solution, then I think, yeah, maybe we'll get there. If you're dissatisfied with that and you want to get beyond that to an underlying explanation of why consciousness existed in the first place in physical terms, well, that's going to promote a whole lot more philosophical disagreement. I'm skeptical that you're going to be able to get there, but who's to say? It's early days in the science and philosophy of consciousness. We've only been going at it a couple of thousand years. In the millennia to come, who knows where this will go? I think we need to have some humility.
Okay, that's a nice note to end on, humility. Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate it. I just want to tell everybody out there, Dave's book is really fascinating, very well written, very clear, just filled with provocative ideas. And I strongly urge all of you to check it out. Thanks again, Dave.
In a good bookstore near you.
Right.
Thanks so much, John. This was great. And thanks to everyone for the questions.
Yeah. Hope to see you at NYU again one of these days.
That'll be great.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers, John. Cheers, everyone.
Bye.